Jerome Powell said that it would be necessary to cause a recession. He said there will be pain ahead in the economy. He said layoffs are going to increase. And he said that the housing market is going to crash. Hi guys, it's Stock Curry, and while the Fed raised interest rates as expected, it's what Jerome Powell said that was really scary. He talked about causing a recession, crashing the housing market, and a bunch of other things that you need to know about. So let's get into it! The Federal Reserve on Wednesday raised interest rates by 0.75%, which was right in line with expectations. But it's what the Federal Reserve pledged to do in the future that really spooked the markets. This month's September Fed meeting was a special one because at this FOMC meeting, or Federal Open Market Committee meeting, the Fed released their quarterly summary of economic projections. Now, the Summary of Economic Projections, or SOEP, is really important because not only does it tell us how much the Fed raised interest rates by today, as well as why, more importantly, it estimates how much the Fed will raise interest rates by in the future, as well as gives us some economic projections about where the Fed sees GDP and inflation going in the future as well. The Fed was widely expected to raise their projected funds rates, but it was the amount of the raise that really spooked the markets. The Federal Reserve is now expecting to end the year at about a 3.4% federal funds rate. Keep in mind that with today's rate increase, the federal funds rate is now a variable 3% to 3.25%. So if the Fed were to raise their funds rate to either 4.25% or 4.5%, we're talking about another 1.25% increase through the end of this year. Now, the Federal Reserve only has two meetings left, one in November and one in December, which means the Federal Reserve is now projected to do another fourth in a row 0.75% rate hike in November, and then a 50 basis point or 0.5% rate hike in December. Now, this is the fastest rate of rate hikes since the Paul Volker era. So we can now say that the Federal Reserve is going Paul Volker. The first thing we should talk about is that the Federal Reserve expected GDP in 2022 to be at 1.7%. Now, after the first two quarters were negative, the Federal Reserve has now lowered that GDP to 0.2%. But later in the video, I'm going to show you why that might actually remain negative. And if we take a look at the Fed's projections for inflation, this is why I think the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates even more than what they're currently predicting. 3 months ago, the Fed predicted that inflation would be at 5.2%. They expected inflation to start coming down. So far, it has not. We have not had a single month where inflation has come down. Despite inflation being stickier and much higher than expected, the Fed only raised their inflation projection by 0.2%. Keep in mind, we're currently over 8. Now, the Fed's projections will be helped by the simple fact that inflation is reported as a year-over-year number. And so far, we've been comping against very low inflation, less than 1%. But starting in October, we're going to be comping against inflation that last year was running about 2 to 3%, which automatically, just the math works out, the year-over-year annualized inflation will drop by about 2 or 3%. So we're looking at inflation dropping from 8.5% down to around 6 to 6.5%, even if inflation stays the same, just because of the higher comps that we're comparing against from last year. Still, that 6 to 6.5% is much higher than the Fed's current prediction of 5.4%. Now, the Fed is also expecting inflation to drop to 2.8% next year. Again, that could happen just simply because we will now be comping against inflation rates of 6, 7, 8, 9%. So that, again, is very possible even if inflation stays exactly the same as where it is today. This leads me to some good but also some scary things that Jerome Powell said during his speech today. Now, when the stock market got news of the SOEP and had a chance to read it and saw just how much they were planning to raise interest rates by, the stock market initially sold off by about 1%. But once Jerome Powell started speaking, we saw the stock market rise by about 2% from that level. And the reason is because of Jerome Powell's definition of a restrictive policy. A lot of people thought that meant that Jerome Powell was going to raise interest rates up to 8, 9, 10, 20%, just like Paul Volker did. However, Jerome Powell clarified that what he really means by restrictive policy is that he expects to keep interest rates at around 4, 4.5%, and he expects inflation to come down due to the comp effect that I just talked about. And if inflation comes down to, say, 2.5%, and the interest rates are at 4.5%, well, guess what? We now have a 2% restrictive policy since interest rates are 2% higher than inflation. So Jerome Powell, when he talked about restrictive policy, was not talking about going full out Paul Volcker and raising interest rates a ton. He was simply talking about inflation falling below the current Fed funds rate, or at least where they expect the Fed's fund rate to be in the next 3 to 4 months. And that's why the stock market rallied by about 2% when Jerome Powell said that. Now, the stock market then turned around and started selling off quite rapidly, falling 2.5% once Jerome Powell started talking about the housing market. Jerome Powell said that it would be necessary to cause a recession. He essentially took a soft landing completely off the table at this point. He said we are going to enter into a recession and that it would be necessary to do that in order to get inflation down. That rising interest rates are going to have to continue no matter how much it gets worse. He said there will be pain ahead in the economy. He said layoffs are going to increase. And he said that the housing market is going to crash. Jerome Powell is actually looking for housing sales to slow down. He's looking to raise interest rates on mortgages, and he wants home prices to come down because this will help bring down inflation. And that spooked the stock markets due to the eerie similarities from 2008. Mortgage rates are now expected to rise significantly after Jerome Powell's speech, and they could get as high as 6, 7, 8%. Experts say housing prices will also start to drop soon, and that's exactly what Jerome Powell wants. Now, we're already seeing home sales decline and prices fall as mortgage rates rise, but Jerome Powell wants this to occur at a much faster pace. Jerome Powell specifically said that we've only seen a very small move in home prices and decline in sales. He wants that to be significantly faster. So Jerome Powell really wants to crash the housing market in order to get inflation down. The stock market ended much lower after Jerome Powell stopped talking, and the markets were down over 1% across the board. Now, the really scary thing here is the technical levels, because there was a key dollar amount that we did not want the S&P to fall below, and unfortunately, it fell below that today. Many people have been warning that if the S&P 500 were to fall below this particular level, that it would cause a major sell-off and we would fall well below those June lows. So it's no surprise that stock futures are falling. They're currently down about 1% as of the recording of this video, and the stock market is expected to continue falling significantly through the end of September. Keep in mind that the last week of September is historically the worst week of the year for the stock market. So if the stock market were to decline significantly during this last week of September, it would just be in line with how the stock market historically trades. Now, let's talk about this upcoming recession and when we might expect it. We know that the United States is already in a paper recession, but I want to talk about what's going to happen when the real recession hits. Today's Fed decision sent U.S. Treasury yields in different directions. The longer-term Treasury yields dropped, while the shorter-term Treasury yields rose. Now, when the shorter-term Treasury yields are higher than the longer-term Treasury yields, this is called an inversion. To calculate an inversion, you simply take the 10-year Treasury yield, which is where people expect the federal funds rate to be 10 years from now, averaged out, and then you subtract the shorter-term Treasury yield, and that's just where people expect the federal funds rate to be in the short term, averaged out. Now, historically, we look at the 2-year and 10-year Treasury yield inversion to determine when a recession might be coming up. And that inverted some time ago, many months ago, that inverted, pointing to a recession on the horizon. But there's actually a far better recession indicator when we're trying to figure out the timing of a recession. And that is the 10-year minus 3-month Treasury yield. When the 3-month Treasury yield is higher than the 10-year Treasury yield, that inversion signals a recession within 6 to 12 months, typically right around 12 months. Now, it's important to point out that this is not yet inverted. We are currently at 0.2%. Now, this could invert this week. We'll have to wait and see, but so far it has not. And if a recession typically occurs 12 months after this inverts, we're not looking at a real major recession until the end of 2023 or possibly the beginning of 2024. One of the things you need to watch out for as the U.S. economy falls deeper into recession is an increase in the number of layoffs. We will see more and more companies doing layoffs. We will see companies do layoffs more frequently, and we will see the amount of people getting laid off increase. This will balloon until we hit the worst of the recession. As you can see here, Meta, which is Facebook, is quietly looking to reduce costs by another 10%, and that means more people are going to get laid off. Google has also quietly required some employees to look for new jobs. And in addition to layoffs, we're going to see more and more companies go out of business. Keep in mind that historically, 80% of all of the stocks in the stock market will eventually go to zero. So you really have to be careful in selecting which stocks you invest in. During the dot-com bubble, we saw 60% of tech stocks go out of business, and during the financial crisis, we saw 40% of companies go out of business. And once again, companies are starting to go out of business, with Kitty Hawk, an air taxi startup, being the latest victim. In future videos, I will give you more information about how the war in Ukraine, the Federal Reserve's raising of interest rates, and the housing market will affect the stock market as well as your finances personally. So make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss a thing. If you got a lot out of this video, go ahead and hit the like button and share this video with your friends. And if you want to compare what Jerome Powell said in June to what he said this month, you can go watch this video that I uploaded here.